So we'll be reading and exploring step 1 in the AA 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, bringing our slaa experience to this book so that, we can be helped in understanding this step. Step 1, as it's written in the AA 12 and 12, is step 1. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. So in step 1, we are helped to partly through meeting other people that are no longer living in what we think almost is the only reality and the only possibility for us. We come into contact with a solution, and I feel that solution is part of what gives us strength, the grace that gives us strength to see and understand our powerlessness and to really see and accept our addiction. And with slaa and codependency, the powerlessness, that we get to see, might have different flavors for all of us. And it's so important to be radically and deeply honest about what our addiction is. Whether that's obsessive thinking and attempts to control other people, to get love, to get safety, to get connection from them through romance, through sex, through we all have different patterns. Part of seeing our patterns, I think, is also listening to others, and we see our strengths and we see our weaknesses in the fellowship. So we'll read a little bit. So who cares to admit complete defeat? Practically no one, of course. And of course, admitting complete defeat is almost an impossibility. I feel that for a long period, I almost convinced myself that this is how I wanted to live and this is who I was. And that was partly because to admit that I was defeated without a solution, without a vision of how I would leave the self that I had created and the way that I had shaped my life in this constant craving to be loved in a way that was destructive to me and other people. Admitting defeat was overwhelming, terrifying, and almost impossible because there was no solution in front of me. So I almost pretended to myself that this is who I was and this is how I wanted to be. Every natural instinct cries out against the idea of personal powerlessness. And perhaps that's also slightly the culture that we live in terms of living in a very materialistic and individualistic culture. And it's one of the blessings of addiction potentially is that it brings us back more to humility and connection with others and acceptance of the multifaceted nature of being human, the weaknesses as well as the strengths, but our utter unavoidable interdependence. That I feel that in addiction we almost live with a denial of that's the way that life is. And so it is truly awful to admit that, and I'm going to change this to make it appropriate to start, that we have warped our minds into such an obsession for destructive connections, destructive cravings, destructive ideas of love, of self, of life, of others, that only an act of providence can remove it from us. No other kind of bankruptcy is like this one. So addiction becomes the it was a solution. It was lending us money and symbolic money, currency in the world to just try and get by. And at this point, we have bled ourselves and our learning capacity out, and we're faced with utter, incomprehensible demoralization and bankruptcy. Our solution doesn't work anymore, but there seems to be no other solution. So it talks about addiction bleeding us of all self-sufficiency and all will to resist its demands, that we're so weakened in a way by our dependence and indebtedness and utter reliance on our addiction to help us cope with and deal with life, help us try and live in the illusion that we can control life, that we can control others, that we can control ourselves. And there's an utter emptiness and powerlessness that comes from making addiction a higher power, making addiction a solution. That our spirit gets weakened, our mind gets weakened, our emotional natures get weakened. Once this stark fact is accepted, our bankruptcy as going human concerns is complete. And so they speak about entering the fellowship. We soon take quite another view of this absolute humiliation. We perceive that only through utter defeat are we able to take our first steps toward liberation and strength. And we can see that we live with the very dualistic concepts and are very quick to say what's good and bad. And here we see that in a way, this utter defeat is grace, is a blessing, to be utterly defeated when it comes to the effectiveness and the buy-in to our addiction. Is a wonderful place to be, because it's the place where the door opens to a whole new way of living and a whole new experience of ourselves and of relationships. Our admissions of personal powerlessness finally turn out to be the firm bedrock upon which happy and purposeful lives may be built. I'm in another fellowship and have sat in the rooms with a fellow who, every time she shares, she'll say, I'm grateful for every single bite, which has got me to this moment. It's a program for eating disorders. And in that way, we can be grateful for every single choice, every single interaction, every single indiscretion, broken heart, brokenheartedness that we've experienced. That have got us to this point, because we needed that much pain, obviously, or I needed that much pain to get to a point where I could finally face my way of doing things doesn't seem to be working. And I think that someone else could have seen and pointed that out very, very clearly, with a lot of scientific evidence, factual observations. They could have pointed that out to me decades ago. But we are often the last people to catch on because we have so much more invested in the solutions that have become not only addictions, but very self-destructive or often destructive to other human beings. But in seeing and admitting the powerlessness, I feel that that's how we start to find ground, and that's how I started to find safety and connection again. It was almost in admitting the powerlessness that I was able to finally drop back more into my being, rather than constantly living in this external kind of whirlwind of emotional chaos, even when I wasn't necessarily acting out in my relationships per se. There was all of this emotional storm constantly as I tried to manage and control life and others from such a place of fear and desperation and inner lack. So it's almost in seeing that, there's a kindness in seeing and acknowledging the powerlessness that for me has that for me has kind of led me to the only ground from which I can walk towards recovery, the only ground in which I can stand in recovery, and the only ground in which I can actually connect back to a loving relationship with myself and with others and with a higher power. It's only when I own my reality that I can almost tend to it, care for it. So we know that little good can come to any alcoholic who joins AA unless they have first accepted their devastating weakness and all its consequences. So our weakness can be our utter undoing. Yeah, so our weakness obviously can defeat us to the point of suicide and death, and it can also be, once it's acknowledged and respected and cared for, it can be our greatest strength, which is hard to see when we're in the desperate place that a lot of us come into the program in. Utterly defeated, utterly brokenhearted, huge amounts of shame, desperate loneliness. There's a lot of emotional anguish. So it can be hard to see that our addiction can almost lead us to creating a much deeper, surer foundation for a way of living that actually works. But for me, it was definitely a stepping stone towards creating that, as crazy as it may sound. But unless we accept our weakness, it will be our greatest adversary. And when we accept it, it leads us to a way of living and life experiences that we could never have created for ourselves. I would never have imagined all of the people that I've met and who have helped me and who I've been able to walk alongside and witness and love, and all of the ways that my life has opened up through acknowledging this weakness and acknowledging that I desperately needed a solution for it and being willing to to take action. So I'll go back to the text. So they write that we shall find no enduring strength until we first admit complete defeat, and that this is the main taproot from which our whole society has sprung and flowered. And I know that sometimes, for instance, if I'm feeling an out of control urge, self-destructive or addictive urge, just simply repeating to myself step one, and that I'm powerless, and that there is a different way of living, can strangely, instead of it becoming a place of complacency and victimness, and I think there's a lot of aversion to the word powerlessness from communities who are looking into 12 steps. But for me, when I acknowledge that powerlessness, really, really admit and surrender to it, I'm given so much power. I still don't quite know how that works, but so when first challenged to admit defeat, most of us revolted. we had approached AA expecting to be taught self-confidence. So a lot of people come into SLA expecting to be taught self-confidence, self-respect, how to how to have relationships that work, and it's almost like missing a step, because the fundamental thing is that our relationship with ourselves and with our connection to source, whether we call that God or Allah, or great spirit of the universe, that connection is really deeply ruptured. And that if we're simply taught self-confidence, that's just going to be a layer of icing on a cake that is primarily made of ingredients that you wouldn't want to put near your mouth. So it's actually, this is a program where we get to rediscover our true nature and our true foundation, like the true wellspring of our being, the true source from which we are created and from which life is created, and we get to surrender into that, rather than trying to pull ourselves out of our character defects and of our addiction with self-confidence and self-esteem. Those things naturally come when we're connected to source, but we're not trying to will our way into, to affirm our way into that. We're connecting to something that naturally gives us that. And the way that I have found that connection comes is partly, it's a multi-step process. But in step one, the way that we're stepping towards that reconnection to power, to source, is through admitting our way of living is just not working. We've tried from every single different angle to make it work. Like, I've tried from every single different angle to making another human being my higher power and the source of my love, my security, my well-being, my purpose, my security. I've tried that from every single different angle. I've been a caregiver. I've tried to do it through seduction. I've tried to do it through, being really nice. I've tried to do it through controlling and manipulating, getting angry, even if it was unconscious. Like, so much of this was unconscious. There was just a desperate powerlessness, believing that a normal, often very flawed and often very unavailable human being could give me everything that, everything that I was searching for in my life. It could, resolve childhood trauma. I could do this in an instant. Like, there was such deep powerlessness and unmanageability that came from the powerlessness around this delusion and around this addiction. And so admitting complete defeat is actually a really wonderful place to be. I don't want to still be championing and advocating for a cause that was lost before it even started. Even if I can manipulate and control, or, kind of whatever, someone else into being exactly who I think I want and need them to be, that is not freedom. That's not respect and love for another person, and that's not respect and love for me. So there is no way in which I'm hoping that my love addiction and codependency could actually work for me right now. Admitting defeat feels very, very positive. But it can be really hard, especially when, we're so convinced that the person that we just broke up with, or that just broke up with us, is our source of happiness and is our only security and is our only possibility of experiencing love and connection. And it can take a while to come out of that delusion and fixation, and to understand that it's not the absence of that person that's creating the suffering. It's the addiction and the attachment and the craving and the thought processes and the way that we live around that itself that create the suffering. It's that It's not that the other person is depriving us of love, it's that we are depriving ourselves of love through our addictive processes, through our attachments and our demands, through our resentments and our hurts, and through denial and delusion, that leads to huge self-abandonment, often re-traumatization, because when we're in denial about, and self-hatred, and a lot of our systems are shut down in terms of recognizing safe, healthy situations and dangerous, unhealthy situations. I know that for myself, I have re-traumatized myself, and hurt myself really pretty severely in this addiction. So it's a wonderful place to be starting to even be willing to admit complete defeat. And we can pray for the willingness to be willing to admit complete defeat.